Chapter 8, An Unwritten Language. Colorado was an unwritten language, one of the 2,000 or so without a single page of the Bible that I had heard about as a college student. This has stunned me. Could I perhaps help to reduce this figure? I had received good marks in language studies at school and had a certain knack for mimicry. It looked as though God was directing me towards language work rather than medical work. Other things conspired to steer me in this direction, and between my junior and senior years in college, I changed my major to classical Greek with a view to using the Greek in the translation of the New Testament. After graduation, I took a summer course in linguistics at the University of Oklahoma under the auspices of an organization known as the Wycliffe Bible Translators, or the Summer Institute of Linguistics. I completed the required course, but like most others who take it, did not become a part of the organization. The first thing one must do to learn an unwritten language is to find an informant, someone willing to help, someone with enough patience to sit for long periods saying the same things over and over while the foreigner struggles to write them down. This is an exceedingly boring task. For the Indian, who has never had to learn his own language so far as he can recall, it is impossible to fathom the difficulty this otherwise reasonably intelligent adult has in hearing what the Indian says. The foreigner can't hear it, he can't reproduce it, and he can't understand what it means. He is making strange marks on paper all the time, which seems quite beside the point, and tomorrow he will make the same hilarious blunders, peer intently into the informant's mouth while he speaks, and ask the same imbecilic questions. Not many people want a job like that. But I felt certain that with the help of Doreen and Barbara, I would soon find one who would do it for a modest price. On the Saturday after my arrival in San Miguel, I saw my first Colorado Indian. I was hanging some sheets out on the line and happened to look up at just the right moment. Out of the forest on the eastern side of the clearing rode a man on horseback. He seemed to be wearing a vermilion-red visored helmet. As he came closer, I could see on top of this a ring of white cotton. His face, arms, and all I could see of his body were painted brilliant red. There were black horizontal stripes beginning at his forehead and painted all the way to his toes, and in between the stripes, black polka dots. He wore a black and white striped skirt, reaching not much below his hips, and over his shoulders he had flung several bright yellow and turquoise cotton scarves. He rode straight to Doreen's gate, hitched his small horse, and walked boldly up to her door. She came out, greeted him, and as I approached, introduced him to me. His straight carriage and beautifully proportioned body had given him the appearance of height, but I saw now that he was not more than 5.5 feet tall. He smiled, revealing black-stained teeth and tongue. His lips, too, were stained blue-black. We shook hands, and if his hands seemed small and hard to me, mine must have seemed startlingly huge and uncallous to him. I asked Doreen, in English, if we might broach the subject of language study, and after a few pleasantries, she edged towards the business with great delicacy. She spoke Spanish to him, which I understood, and he replied, speaking a strange, truncated Spanish, very polite, very devious, and completely non-committal. He would be back, he said. He only wanted some pills now. He was going to town, but he would be back. We gave him the pills, and he mounted his horse and rode off, a flaming spectacle of red, yellow, and turquoise atop a red-brown pony, disappearing once more into the green scrim of the forest on the far side of the clearing. That helmet now, I asked Doreen, what on earth did an Indian need a helmet for? Helmet, she shrieked. That's his hair. She explained that Colorado men plastered their hair with a thick mixture of Vaseline and achiote, a red dye taken from the seed pod of a jungle tree. Perhaps a dozen more Indians rode through the plaza that day on their way to Santo Domingo. They always went to town, Doreen said, on Saturdays. They would lounge around the town square, drink the night away, and we could look for them back again, drunk and toppling off their horses on Sunday. We waylaid several and asked if they would come next week to work for the senorita who wanted to learn their talk. All were amiable and said they would certainly come. During the week that followed, I trekked hopefully with Doreen or Barbara and talked with whomever I found at home. It became clear that no one really intended to work for me. The truth was that Colorados never worked for anybody. Some of them, in fact, actually had white men working for them. They were wealthy because of the export of bananas and achiote, the latter for the coloring of margarine. Money meant very little. They had lived near white men for centuries and had had plenty of opportunity to assess the white man's way of life. A good hard look was enough. They did not like it. They chose to keep to their own ways, spending money only for a few things like salt, kerosene, Vaseline, cotton thread, and gin. They had not the slightest urge to dress like white men, or build houses like theirs, or submit themselves to their economic slavery, and nothing would persuade them otherwise. I was embarrassed and offended by this higher criticism. Nothing had prepared me for it. I was here to help, and these people would not be helped. I had no doubt that God was on my side, and this was a secret satisfaction. Someday, God and I would show these proud, independent Indians that we had plans for them, plans that they would not ultimately succeed in thwarting. One way or another, God would show me the way. I would get a hold of the language, make it my own, harness it into an alphabet, and make of the Indians readers and writers. This would surely happen, but getting them to acknowledge that they were living in bondage, sorrow, and night was going to be a lengthy process. They were not interested, not in the least, in our definition of liberation. Besides, time was always on their side. White men came and went with their plans and projects. They were a nuisance while they were around, but the Indians knew how to keep out of their way and live their hidden lives. I did what any Christian in trouble would do. I prayed. The task was impossible. It couldn't even begin without an informant. So I started with that. I asked specifically for an informant. I was sure that God could budge even a Colorado if he wanted to, especially if that Colorado's soul's salvation depended on it. The question of whether my prayer was according to his will did not, as it often does, seem a difficult one then. The work I hoped to do was God's work. It was his word that was at stake. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. I was his worker. It was all clear and simple. My prayer was as free from selfish and impure motives as any I had ever prayed. I had God's written promises of help, such as that in Isaiah 50 verse 7. The Lord God will help me. Therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed. The prayer was answered. A middle-aged Ecuadorian named Don Macario had been coming to the assembly meetings. His credentials were unparalleled. A white man of Spanish-speaking parentage, he had grown up on a hacienda with Colorado children and was completely bilingual. Hence, he was even better qualified to help me than any Indian would have been. He was, just at this time, out of work. When he learned of my need, he was willing to work for me and at a price that I could afford to pay. He was, above all, a Christian. The ultimate aim of a Bible translation interested him because he had been wishing for some way to serve the Lord. It was the perfect answer for both of us, better than we could have imagined, exceeding abundantly above all that I had asked or thought. We agreed on a regular program of study, and Doreen let me have one of the little rooms of her house to work in, since the school children's racket made concentration impossible in our house. I set up a table and chairs, got out notebooks, file cards, and pencils, and Macario came in for 1 hour every morning and sometimes for another hour in the afternoon. He had no idea of teaching the language, of course, but he could answer my questions, and I had learned at school in Oklahoma what you are supposed to ask. I learned that the Indians called their own language Safiki, the language of the people. The second vowel in the word was a voiceless one pronounced in a whisper, and I soon found that the language was full of these. It took several weeks to find out why Macario was not satisfied with my pronunciation of Shah, meaning let's go. There were actually 2 syllables, the first being a voiceless I pronounced like the English word he, only in a whisper, Shah. There were things called glottal stops, which we pronounce but never write in English. All words beginning with vowels really begin with glottal stops in English. The negative has one in the middle. In Colorado, you have to write glottal stops. I had neat charts of Safiki sounds and syllables, shuffling them around to work our systems and patterns. To figure out the divisions between words was nearly as absorbing as working out the plot of a mystery story. At first I wrote only what we call sequences, making divisions between them by guesswork. Macario had never thought about what constituted a single word. He spoke, but did not analyze the language. He thought in phrases, as we all do, until we read and write a language. He would repeat phrases to me, but it was next to impossible to get him to say a noun or a verb by itself. Little by little, by endless charting and comparing and filing, I began to recognize what were probably prefixes, infixes, and suffixes, and these gave me a clue to where word borders were, and I began to draw lines. If Macario did not recognize a single word out of its context, he certainly did not recognize syllables by themselves and could not identify the meanings of suffixes, but he could think of examples of where they occurred, and I wrote each example on a separate slip of paper and filed it. A second grader might, for example, have a hard time telling his teacher what ing means in English, but he might think of words like eating and running and swimming. Eventually, the linguist would find a label for ing. Next, I would try to identify the class of suffix or prefix I was working on. Could it appear only with verbs? With nouns as well? Did it occur before or after another suffix? Had it anything to do with the gender of the subject, the shape of the object, or perhaps the time or mode of voice? Did a pronoun such as we include you and me, them and me, or you and them and me? Orthography would be another part of the job. Every sound I could possibly hear or see, in the case of voiceless vowels, I could sometimes recognize them only by seeing the lip and tongue position rather than by hearing. I wrote down, using the phonetic symbols, but I had to try to reduce the Safiki alphabet to the fewest possible letters that would adequately represent the sounds. In English, for example, we have only one written form of the letter T, although it has two pronunciations. These are phonetic, which means they have different sounds as the T in top, aspirated, and the T in stop, unaspirated. They are not, however, phonemic. That is, they need not be written differently in the English alphabet because aspirated T's occur only in certain positions distinct from that of unaspirated T's. A simple rule can guide the foreigner in pronunciation. But the English alphabet has many features that are not nearly so neat. There are several pronunciations for each of the 5 vowels, and this difficulty is compounded by the many vowel combinations. Take OU, for example, in the words tough, though, through, thought, and plow. We wanted to avoid problems like this for the Colorado if we were ever going to teach them to read their language, and it would be of no use to reduce their language to writing if they were never going to read it. We wanted it to be as simple as possible. When I reduced the alphabet to the smallest number of symbols needed, I had a phonemic alphabet. I then began to write a simple primer that Barbara and Doreen could use to teach the Colorados to read. Besides being an invaluable informant, Macario ran a little store for us. We tried to think of ways to bring the Indians to our clearing as much as possible, and a store seemed a good idea. We also thought it might keep some of them from going to Santo Domingo, where they sometimes were robbed and nearly always got drunk. Macario was in the shop one day, and I was sitting in my study room nearby waiting for him to begin our session. 2 old Colorado women came into the study dressed in brightly colored striped skirts, beads, and red paint. Their hair hung down, long and straight, over their bare breasts. Each had a mirror hanging around her neck on a piece of string. They wanted me to come with them to the schoolroom in the other house. I could not make out why, but followed them over, and they pointed to the folding organ we used for our meetings. "Can you play?" they asked in Spanish. "Yes." "Then play," they said. I played some simple hymn tunes while they sat and twiddled their toes and ran their hands through their hair. When I thought they had had enough, I stopped playing, but they begged for more, and I played until my legs ached from pumping. Macario came in, and I asked him if he thought I might take the old woman's picture. He talked to them for a long time in Safiki, assuring them that the camera would not make them sick, and they consented. Then I sat with them on the veranda, listened to their talk, sorting out of it several words that I could write down. I told Barbara about the delightful hour I had spent with them. "Oh, yes, I know those two," Barbara said. "Sporting old sticks, aren't they?" That priceless British manner of speaking never failed to delight me. Barbara's description of the Indian women seemed to me a perfect one, as well as for her and Doreen. They took their work, but not themselves, seriously, keeping always a stiff upper lip, treating the rest of us, Americans, Indians, and Ecuadorians, as fellow players in a great game. I don't recall hearing either complain of physical hardships of any kind. There was a remarkably unself-conscious courage and toughness about these two women that inspired me, and although I'm sure that neither was aware of it, made me treat my own troubles more lightly.